At 0612 local time, the USS Abraham Lincoln was cutting through the gray-green waters of the Arabian Sea at 28 knots, her flight deck alive with the controlled chaos of a carrier strike group running at full combat readiness. The Lincoln had been in the region for 11 days, positioned as part of a broader deterrence posture, following weeks of escalating Iranian rhetoric and a series in the Strait of Hormuz that had pushed Washington and Tehran to the edge than at any point in the past 2 decades. Nobody on the Lincoln's bridge expected the morning of February 3rd to be the morning it all went wrong. They were wrong about that. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace had been planning Operation Promised Retribution for 6 weeks. The plan was audacious by any measure, a coordinated, multi-axis ballistic and cruise missile strike against the crown jewel of American no power in the region, designed to humiliate the United States in front of the world, demonstrate that no American asset was beyond reach, and force Washington into a political retreat that Tehran believed would fracture the coalition arrayed against it. The Iranians had convinced themselves, based on years of American restraint and political hesitation, that if they struck hard enough and fast enough, the U.S. would blink. They were about to discover the catastrophic cost of that miscalculation. The opening salvo came from 3 directions simultaneously, which told American analysts immediately that this was not an improvised response, but a carefully orchestrated operation. From the Iranian coast, 2 batteries of Shah-3 medium-range ballistic missiles roared off their launch pads in the pre-dawn darkness, their solid rocket boosters throwing columns of flame visible from 60 kilometers away. From launch sites in western Iran, a second wave of Emad missiles, a more advanced Iranian ballistic weapon with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed specifically to terminal phase interceptors, were already climbing toward the edge of the atmosphere. And from the water, from fast boats and semi-submersible platforms that Iranian forces had quietly positioned over the preceding weeks, a swarm of Soumar cruise missiles, Iran's domestically produced version of the Soviet K-45, came in low over the wave tops, hugging the surface at 50 meters, trying to sneak beneath American radar coverage. The Lincoln's AN/SPY-6 radar, the most advanced air and missile defense sensor ever deployed on a U.S. carrier, detected all of it within 90 seconds of the first launch. The SPY-6 is not the same system that struggled against ballistic threats in previous decades. It operates in S-band with a sensitivity improvement of 35 times over its predecessor, meaning it can track a basketball-sized object at the range a previous system could barely detect a fighter jet. The radar operators in the Lincoln's Combat Information Center watched as the track picture built itself in real time. Dozens of contacts, ballistic arcs curving downward toward the carrier group, cruise missiles threading through terrain features at sea level, a wall of incoming fire that would have overwhelmed any previous generation of naval air defense. What Iran did not know, what their 6 weeks of planning had fatally failed to account for, was that the Lincoln was not alone and had not been alone for the past 72 hours. The strike group arrayed around the Lincoln was the most capable surface action group ever assembled in the Arabian Sea. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the USS Stockdale and the USS Spruance, operated on the Lincoln's flanks, their Aegis combat systems linked into a composite air picture that gave every group the same sensor picture simultaneously. Behind them, the USS Bunker Hill, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser whose Aegis Baseline 9 system had been specifically optimized for ballistal defense, sat at a range that put her VLS cells in the optimal intercept geometry for the incoming Shahab and Emad missiles, and operating in a coordinated pattern 40 kilometers to the north, invisible to Iranian surface radar and flying at 50,000 feet. 2 E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft had been airborne for 3 hours, their rotating radomes painting the entire battle space with a clarity that gave the strike group's commanders complete situational awareness of everything flying within 400 kilometers. The first intercept happened 47 seconds after launch detection. The Bunker Hill's combat system had already computed firing solutions for the incoming ballistic missiles before the Lincoln Strike Group commander had finished issuing his first order. 2 Standard Missile 3 Block EAA interceptors erupted from the Bunker Hill's forward VLS cells, their booster stages pushing them to 20 times the speed of sound in the opening seconds of flight. The SM-3 Block UAA is a cooperative development between the United States and Japan, and its kill vehicle, the kinetic warhead that separates from the rocket motor and guides itself to intercept, is the most precise anti-ballistic missile weapon ever built. It does not carry an explosive warhead. It kills its target purely through kinetic energy, a hypervelocity collision in space that converts relative velocity into a pulse of destructive force sufficient to vaporize an incoming warhead. The first Shahab-3 disintegrated at an altitude of 140 kilometers, its debris scattered harmlessly across an impact footprint 1,000 kilometers from the Lincoln. The second SM-3 3 found its target 4 seconds later. On the Lincoln's flight deck, the klaxon that had sent pilots sprinting for their aircraft was already triggering a response that Iran had not factored into their models. The carrier's deck crew worked with a speed and precision born of thousands of hours of drills. Fa-8ATE Super Hornets were pushed to their catapult positions. The Lincoln operated a wing of 44 aircraft, and the decision to immediately launch a combat air patrol of maximum strength had been made by Rear Admiral James Carver in the carrier's flag bridge within 90 seconds of the first radar track appearing on his display. Carver was a man who had spent 31 years preparing for exactly this moment, and he did not hesitate. While his ships were shooting down the first wave of Iranian missiles, he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Because this was not just a defensive problem. Iran had just committed an act of war against the United States Navy, and the response was going to be overwhelming. The Soumar cruise missiles were the more technically challenging part of the intercept problem, flying at 50 meters above the water, designed to exploit the radar horizon that limits surface ship detection at low altitudes. They were betting on the physics of the Earth's curvature to keep them hidden until they were inside the effective range of Standard Missile 2. What they ran into instead was the E-2T Hawkeye's radar, which, operating at altitude, had no radar horizon problem whatsoever. The Hawkeye's ANAPI-9I radar detected the cruise missile swarm at a range of 310 kilometers, well before they could threaten any ship in the group, and automatically passed tracks to every Aegis platform in the strike group. The Stockdale and Spruance turned to meet them, their SPY D1D radars locking up the incoming missiles, and their VLS cells beginning to cycle as SM-2 Block 3 interceptors began flowing out of the ship's vertical launchers in a sustained volley that filled the morning sky with exhaust trails. The SM-2 engagements happened at ranges between 40 and 80 kilometers, well outside the threat's lethal envelope. Soumar cruise missiles were launched in the opening phase. All 23 were destroyed before any of them came within 30 kilometers of the Lincoln. The intercept geometry was not even particularly challenging for the Aegis crews, because the composite picture from the Hawkeye gave them trajectory data and timing that allowed the trial computers to sequence intercepts with the precision of a machine sorting packages, one after another, methodically, without drama. The Iranian cruise missile wave, which Tehran had spent months preparing and which had been presented to the supreme leader as a weapon that would slip beneath American defenses like a blade under armor, had been completely destroyed before a single Iranian warhead came close enough to matter. The second wave of Iranian ballistic missiles was already in flight when the first wave was being destroyed.
Leaked satellite imagery shows a major strike on an Iranian missile facility in western Iran, with launch pads destroyed and heavy smoke rising.
Introducing unpredictability into their terminal trajectory, forcing the kill vehicle to correct its approach angle in the final seconds before impact. Iranian engineers had studied U.S. ballistic missile defense for years and had specifically designed the Emad maneuvering system to exploit what they believed was a vulnerability in the SM-3's guidance algorithm. What they had not studied was the SM-3 Block EOA's upgraded kill vehicle, which incorporated a new sensor suite and guidance computer that had been specifically developed to handle maneuvering re-entry vehicles. The 2 Emad missiles launched in the second wave were detected, tracked, and assigned intercept solutions by the Bunker Hill's Aegis system before their maneuvering systems had even activated. Both were destroyed in the exoatmospheric phase at an altitude of 112 kilometers before the maneuvering portion of their flight profile could begin. The engineering advantage Iran believed it had was, in operational terms, irrelevant. By 4 minutes and 17 seconds after the first launch detection, every Iranian missile in the OPEC had been destroyed, not degraded, not partially intercepted, every single one. The Lincoln was untouched, her aircraft were airborne, and Rear Admiral Carver was looking at a strike package that had been building in the flag bridge for the last 3 minutes. Because tracking data from the SM-3 intercepts and the Hawkeye's radar had back-calculated the launch positions of every Iranian battery that had fired. The locations were precise. The targets were valid military installations. The President of the United States had already authorized a response under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, the inherent right of self-defense, and the orders coming from CENTCOM were unambiguous. The United States Navy was going to respond, and it was going to respond immediately, and the response was going to make absolutely clear to Iran and to everyone watching that attacking an American carrier strike group was not an act that produced political concessions. It was an act that produced consequences. The first Tomahawk land attack missiles left the VLS cells of the Stockdale and simultaneously at 0618 local time. The Tomahawk Block V, which had entered service in 2021, was not the weapon that had struck Iraq in 1991. It carried a two-way satellite data link that allowed it to be retargeted in flight. Its navigation system integrated GPS with terrain contour matching and a digital scene matching area correlator that could identify its specific aim point from a stored image, even if GPS was being jammed. Its turbofan engine gave it a range of over 1,700 kilometers and the ability to loiter over a target area, waiting for the optimal engagement window before diving into its aim point. 42 Tomahawks were in the air within the first 90 seconds, their flight paths computed by the strike group's tactical data system to arrive on target in a coordinated time-on-target salvo that would saturate Iranian air defenses with simultaneous arrivals from multiple azimuths. The targets were not cities, they were not civilian infrastructure, they were the precise military installations that had launched the attack on the Lincoln, the Shahab and Emad launch sites in western Iran, the command bunker that had coordinated the operation, the radar facilities that had provided targeting data to the cruise missile platforms, the fast boat bases on the Iranian coast from which the Soumar carriers had operated. Each target had been pre-planned, pre-authorized, and pre-loaded into the strike group's weapons database as part of contingency plans that CENTCOM had been updating and refining for years. The Tomahawks were not improvised. They were the execution of a plan that the United States military had been preparing while Iran had been preparing its attack, and the American preparation was considerably more thorough. In the Lincoln's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was one of controlled, professional intensity. There was no panic, no confusion, no chaos. The crew had trained for this. Every watchstander knew their job, knew their system, knew what to do when the world outside the steel hull turned hostile. The air boss was managing the recovery of aircraft that had been airborne when the attack began, slotting them into the landing pattern with the same methodical competence that characterized everything happening on and around the carrier. The damage control teams that had been dozed up in their stations throughout the engagement were being stood down by section as the threat picture cleared. The Lincoln had not taken a single hit. She had not even needed to employ her own close-in weapon systems, the Phalanx CADUS batteries that served as the last line of defense against leakers. The intercepts had been so complete, so total, that nothing had reached the range where close-in defense would have been relevant. On the Iranian side, the picture was different. The Revolutionary Guard's aerospace force had monitored the attack in real time from their operations center outside Tehran, and as the radar tracks of their missiles winked out one by one, the scope of what had happened became clear. The operation that was supposed to send a message had instead delivered a demonstration not of Iranian power, but of the absolute supremacy of American integrated air and missile defense. The generals who had planned operation promised retribution had believed, sincerely and with what they thought was analytical rigor, that a sufficiently large and complex salvo could overwhelm the Lincoln's defenses. They had studied open-source literature on U.S. interceptor stocks. They had calculated reload times. They had modeled Aegis engagement rates. Every model they built said that enough missiles, launched from enough directions, would get through. Every model was wrong, because every model was built on assumptions about American capability that were years out of date, and because no model adequately captured what happened when you combined the SPICE-6 detection range, the SM-3 block EOEAs, the E-2D's radar altitude advantage, and an Aegis combat system that had spent the last decade being specifically optimized for exactly this threat. The Tomahawks were already over Iranian territory when Tehran issued its first public statement, a furious denunciation broadcast on state television that blamed the United States for aggression and promised further retaliation. The statement was still being read when the first weapons began arriving on their targets. The Shahab launch sites in western Iran, the hardened pads and their associated support infrastructure were struck by coordinated salvos that arrived within a 15-second window. The command bunker that had coordinated the attack, buried under 30 meters of reinforced concrete and believed by its designers to be impervious to anything short of a nuclear weapon, was struck by 3 Tomahawks carrying the JASSM-derived hard-target penetrating warhead variant that had been retrofitted into the Block V airframe for exactly this kind of target. The facility was not destroyed superficially, it was destroyed functionally, its command and communications systems reduced to debris, its ability to coordinate further operations eliminated. Throughout the strike, the Lincoln's Combat Information Center maintained complete situational awareness of Iranian air defense reactions. The Iranian military scrambled fighters from Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, F-4 Phantoms, and Russian-supplied Su-24 Fencers that launched into the morning sky with the intention of intercepting the Tomahawk stream. What they encountered was the Lincoln's Combat Air Patrol, a force of F-818E and F-Super Hornets, supported by an E-AAJ Growler Electroner attack aircraft that had been airborne since for the first Iranian missile launched. The Growler's ALQ-99 and the next-generation jamming pods it carried filled the electromagnetic spectrum with noise that blinded the Iranian aircraft's radar systems, degrading their ability to find targets while simultaneously masking the Tomahawks in a fog of electronic interference that the older Iranian avionics could not penetrate. The Iranian fighters turned back before they came within engagement range of the Hornets. Their attempt to intervene in the strike had accomplished nothing. The last Tomahawk struck its target at 0641 local time. In 23 minutes, the United States Navy had absorbed a coordinated multi-axe ballistic and cruise missile attack against its most valuable forward-deployed asset, destroyed every element of that attack before it caused any damage, identified and geolocated every launch site that participated in the attack, and conducted a precision retaliatory strike that eliminated Iran's ability to conduct a repeat operation from the specific facilities that had been used. The Lincoln was sailing at 28 knots, her flight deck operations continuing normally, her crew beginning the process of accounting for ordnance expended and restocking the VLS cells from the ammunition ship that was already being called forward. To a casual observer looking at the carrier group from the air, nothing about the morning's events would have been visible. No fireage, no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred, just a carrier strike group doing what it was designed to do. The strategic message was not subtle. Iran had attempted to demonstrate that it could reach out and strike an American carrier, the most powerful symbol of U.S. military projection, and force a political response. What it had demonstrated instead was the opposite. It had shown every government, every military, every strategic planner watching from Beijing to Moscow to Pyongyang that the United States Navy's integrated air and missile defense was not a theoretical capability on paper. It was operational, proven, and so far beyond what any regional power had fielded that the gap between American capability and the threats arrayed against it was not measured in increments but in generations. The Iranians had fired their most capable ballistic missiles, their most capable cruise missiles, in a coordinated attack designed specifically to defeat American defenses. The defense had not been stressed. It had not been challenged at its limits. It had operated with margins to spare. Within hours of the engagement, the diplomatic consequences began cascading through the region. Gulf states that had quietly been hedging their relationships with Tehran issued statements of support for the United States that were more explicit and more unambiguous than anything they had said in years. The reason not political calculation, or not primarily. It was the recognition, shared by every military analyst in the region, that the morning of February 3rd had produced a definitive demonstration. The calculation that Iran had tried to use, that American restraint was weakness, that a sufficiently audacious strike would produce political concessions, had been tested against reality and found catastrophically false. And the strikes on the launch sites had made clear that the United States reserved the right to respond immediately and precisely against any military asset used to attack American forces. Aboard the Lincoln, Rear Admiral Carver addressed his crew over the ship's public address system that evening. His remarks were brief. He told them they had done their jobs. He told them the training, the drills, the long hours at sea away from their families had prepared them for exactly this moment. He told them the world had watched today and seen what an American carrier strike group could do. And he told them that the mission was not over, that the Lincoln would remain on station, that their presence in the region continued to serve the purpose it had always served, to make clear that the United States of America would not be deterred, would not be intimidated, and would not allow its forces to be attacked without consequence. The crew's response echoed through every rebirthing space and passageway on the ship. What happened on February 3rd would be analyzed by military planners, think tanks, and defense ministries for years. The engagement validated every dollar spent on the SPY-6 radar upgrade program. It validated the SM-3 Block OUA's development and the cooperative research effort that had produced it. It validated the E-2D Hawkeye's contribution to composite air defense and the concept of network integrated missile defense that American naval architects had been building since the 1990s. It also validated a broader principle, one that American defense planners had argued for decades against those who believed that missiles and drones had rendered large surface combatants obsolete. The carrier strike group, operating with its full complement of sensors, shooters, and support platforms, was not a vulnerable relic of a previous era. It was the most capable force projection system ever built, and on the morning of February 3rd, it proved it against the most serious direct attack on an American carrier since World War II. Iran's calculation was not a failure of courage or commitment. It was a failure of intelligence, a profound and systemic underestimation of American capability, root ears of wishful analysis that prioritized ideology over honest technical assessment. The Revolutionary Guard's planners had built their models on what they hoped was true rather than what they knew to be true, and the gap between hope and reality had been measured in missiles that never came close to their target. What followed politically, the back-channel communications, the messages passed through intermediaries, the quiet signals from Tehran that Operation Promised Retribution was not the beginning beginning of a campaign, but an action whose authors were no longer in a position to repeat it confirmed what the radar tracks had shown. The United States had demonstrated dominance so complete, so technically overwhelming, that even those who had most fervently believed in the attack's feasibility could no longer maintain that belief in the face of the evidence. The Abraham Lincoln turned south that evening, her wake cutting a pale line across the darkening Arabian Sea. Her aircraft were secured on her flight deck, her crew stood down battle stations, her magazines already being restocked by the logistics ships sailing in her wake. She was not withdrawing, she was repositioning to the next tasking. The message her presence in the region had always been to send had now been delivered with a clarity that required no interpretation, no press release, no diplomatic statement. The carrier had been attacked, the carrier had survived, the attackers had not, and the Lincoln sailed on, because that was what American carriers did. They sailed on.